Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And this is our post-Thanksgiving program, recorded a little bit before Thanksgiving, but now broadcast on Thanksgiving weekend. And thank you for being with us. Now, this holiday weekend, with a little bit of surcease from the hectic life of our times, and above all, from the traumatic political events, ought to offer us an occasion for a reflection and to think about something more long-term, right? Some long-term values, in particular, philosophy, above all, and others. Some people find it in religion, and some in a combination of both. And we ought to think about the perspective historically as we go forward, right? How we got here and where we are. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is, of course, everybody's emotional life. We got a very moving communication from a person who said that the political events of the last couple of weeks had reduced them to despair, and they really didn't know what to do. Well, I would say, first of all, that despair is not the right way to respond. Right, what you want to do is take the emotional energy and use it to motivate and propel a kind of political activism. That is what we need. Ultimately, remember, your despair helps nobody. No victim of anything in this world, from the Syrian civil war to some person deprived of their medical care and finding their lives in danger, doesn't help them at all if you are in tremendous mental anguish about it. So that's the first thing. It's just a practical idea, right? The point is to do something about it. Good works, as we say, and we can actually get into that a little bit more. But the idea is you want to do good, and that is the way to deal with whatever emotional issues you may be experiencing. And of course, I would always say that optimism is the best policy. It is the only policy. And I'm very happy, I mean, deeply happy to find a guy who wrote in and said that he had found inspiration to keep going in this program. Somebody wrote in saying, Tarpley, I got to hand it to you. You always bounce back quickly, no matter what happens. Well, yes, I tried to, right? And part of it is having seen some of it. You remember the previous week I was telling you about my experience when I thought the world was coming to an end on the morning of January 20th, 1969, the day of the Nixon inauguration. I thought that first day of the new administration was going to be a series of raids to round up all the opposition and put them in some kind of a confinement, right? Some kind of durance vile. And it didn't happen. And it is always a mistake to take counsel of your fears. So, optimism, right? The entire United States is built on optimism. You could say, in a broader sense, the entire New World, the entire Western Hemisphere is built on optimism. So far be it from us to let down the cause of optimism. You also have to remember the great philosopher Leibniz, right? Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. If you want to look at somebody who is the maker of the modern world, it's probably Leibniz. This is the person, after all, who developed a mechanical computer of tremendous capabilities for those times. He's the father of the modern cybernetic sciences, IT, and the rest of it. And he is the only person to have developed the calculus, right? Newton never had a calculus. He had infinite series. He had, fluxions, whatever he calls them. But the calculus used today is that of Leibniz. It always has been. because there is no other. And this whole story about the simultaneous discovery, this is a bunch of nonsense, right? Don't ever believe the Royal Society of Great Britain. They tell you who came up with this or that invention, because their whole purpose in life is to try to arrogate to themselves the or to some British scientist the credit for these things. So there's plenty to do, and thanks to these institutions that we have, right, the ones that we got from ultimately Machiavelli by way of John Adams into the Massachusetts Constitution and then to the U.S. federal Constitution, right? Even though John Adams was not at Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, 1788, nevertheless, his influence is the greatest because it was sort of axiomatic among most of them that the Massachusetts Constitution, with the three branches, was going to be brought in. So this is a kind of an institution, right? It's a federal constitution, which tends to preserve itself from shock. In other words, to some extent, mechanism, provided that people wake up, provided that people get active, provided that the media radically improve what they're doing, and provided we have an honest discussion about political problems. So that is where we are now. And I urge people, take a holiday now, turn away from the, at least for a couple of days, from the immediate hectic routine. I also would say the pronouncements coming from the new administration are so variegated and so changeable. And I wouldn't hang on any of this. In other words, the personalities whose names are floated, and this goes across the stage. It's all changing, right? Wait for the final word. Wait for the definitive statement. And then as far as what the policies will be, that also is now changing at an unprecedented rate. So rather than try to follow it, unless you're a professional and you have time to do it, probably better to think about sources of inspiration. Inspiration. And some of it means finding the examples in the past, finding the individuals or the movements that could teach us something intellectual and organizational and programmatic, but also provide a kind of inspiration in terms of the strength of the will, courage, the power of ideas and ideals, belief in the possibility that the human condition can be improved. And that's, of course, that's the heart of Leibniz, right? Leibniz, in a general way, you can say that the Benjamin Franklin tradition comes out of the Leibniz networks of the early 1700s. And this is, I would call this the real Enlightenment. The Leibniz Enlightenment is the real one. And I have to ask the indulgence of French listeners, but the Voltaire Enlightenment is the fake one. The Voltaire Enlightenment is the venal one. It's the meretricious one. It's the one based on money in particular, right? Voltaire's lifelong obsession. And when we dig into Voltaire a little bit, we'll see that at the beginning of his career, there was a Venetian patrician who seemed to be operating in France, and that guy is the one who got Voltaire the chance to go to Britain for the first time, where he would write his English letters, the ones that put him on the map. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back. The other thing you can do and ought to do, give yourself a treat, reward yourself at the beginning of the holiday season, right? Advent is upon us. And why don't you get really smart and subscribe to the American System, AmericanSystem.tv. americansystem.tv, and that will get you to a place where you can subscribe to the daily version of this, Monday through Thursday. And this is brought to you from Washington, of course, and allows you to keep up with these things from day to day. So that is, I think, a great holiday gift. Get it for yourself. Think about giving that, right? You can give gift subscriptions to the American System Network, and it's up there every day in the evening, usually around 9 o'clock, sometimes a few minutes later than that. But do that, and it's called americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Not yet TV, it's radio, but it is radio for the moment. This is already a lot. And we hope, of course, if we get enough subscribers, we could make the leap into the visual realm. Although some people say, no, Tarpley, you have a face made for radio. So let's see about that. But here we go. The thesis of Leibniz is what? This is the Enlightenment, right? So what he says is science, reason, technology, industry can make the human condition so much better in terms of standard of living, longevity, cultural and material progress, because they go together. The British claim that James Watt invented the steam engine. I don't think so. I think it was the Frenchman Denis Papin, Papin, and he acted under the influence and inspiration of none other than Leibniz. How about that? The steam engine, the computer, and advanced mathematics, calculus. That's quite a plateful. And Leibniz, of course, he was interested in philology. He wanted to know the origins of language, and he was already looking towards the later discoveries. But this was part of his impulse, was to try to figure out what was this Indo-European, as it was later called, the Indo-European language system. What Leibniz did was, as soon as he got a correspondent, right, he was working with letters, went all over the world, and he would send, he'd say, look, translate the Lord's Prayer, right, the Pater Noster, right, Our Father who art in heaven. You, please, wherever you are in the world, translate that into the language where you are. So maybe the letter might be written in Latin or French or something similar, but he would send it, and he'd collect this stuff, and they could make a kind of a linguistic map. So a lot of his stuff was fragmentary. He almost became the Prime Minister of England, and that would have been a great thing for England. But unfortunately, this had to do with the succession relationships between the House of Hanover in Hanover, right, in northern Germany, and then on the other hand, the kings of Great Britain. In other words, instead of George the First, right, Georg Ludwig, George the First, you might have had Princess Sophie of Hanover becoming Queen Sophie of the United Kingdom, and in that case, Leibniz would have been the prime minister. So this is the guy. Now, Voltaire is the opposite of that, right? Voltaire is a cynic and so forth. And when you look at Voltaire's Candide, you'll find the story of Dr. Pangloss. And Dr. Pangloss goes around saying, no matter what happens, no matter how many people get killed, he'd say, all's for the best in the best of all possible worlds. That's a little bit too simple. But remember, you are limited to the possible worlds. In other words, if you want everything automatically good, you don't have free will at the same time. And many of us would say, we would join with Erasmus of Rotterdam, for example, against Luther, in saying that free will is essential, that without this, there's no humanity. You become an automaton, you become a robot. So the idea that you're pre-programmed to only do good, that is probably a sacrifice too large to make. Why not get to the same result through things like education that are based on the free will? Because in any case, the world is what it is. It's not going to be guaranteed good outcome. And as I meant to say, right, when Voltaire started his career, there was this Venetian patrician, Antonio Conti, Conti. I've written about this. I gave a paper about this in Germany 16 years ago, Berlin. So Conti was a guy who intervened a lot in the Newton-Leibniz controversy, always helping Newton, because the Venetians decided that they were going to try to use the British against the Leibniz networks. Because with the Leibniz networks, if you have the spread of science, optimism, reason, it is going to be very, very difficult to maintain an arbitrary oligarchical system. Because the problem with oligarchy is that it is based on an irrational principle of domination. The question is, if you have a society ruled by oligarchs, the question is always, why these people? Why should they rule and not somebody else? And by the way, how are they doing? What is their track record? So that may not be so great. So the more reason, the more science, the more optimism, the more ferment you have, the more the oligarchical social order will be in peril. By the way, this goes back to this, we talked about him, right? There's a Greek historian, more or less a contemporary of Thucydides. He's called the Old Oligarch, right? When you get Francis Godolphin's summary, his edited book of the Greek historians, right? You got Thucydides, Herodotus, so forth. But you've also got this guy called the Old Oligarch. And what the Old Oligarch says is the Athenian navy is based on advanced technology, and it is allowing hoi polloi, people from the lower orders, to enjoy upward mobility, and they're very assertive, and that undermines the privileges of oligarchs like the Old Oligarch. So the Old Oligarch says, shut down that modern technology. The other thing you have in the history of Athens is the long walls, right, from Athens to Piraeus. We'll talk about this in just a second. World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we're just trying to motivate optimism. And once you say optimism, you say Leibniz. And in another sense, once you say America, that's a way of saying optimism, right? In the 19th century into the 20th century, the United States, reputedly the most optimistic country in the world. And that's worth cultivating. I just wanted to wrap up on the origins of the oligarchical dislike of science. That goes back to somebody like the Old Oligarch, right? Again, contemporary of Thucydides. And the Old Oligarch doesn't like the Athenian navy because there's too much technology being spread into the masses. And the other thing he doesn't like is there are now these walls from Athens, which is inland, it's this inland city, but the walls then go down to the port of Piraeus. And as long as you have a wall around Athens and a wall down to Piraeus on both sides, and then walls around Piraeus, the Spartan army can't come and wipe you out. And the Old Oligarch doesn't like that. The Old Oligarch says, I'd rather have a situation where if these Athenian Democrats go too far in their measures, then the good old Spartan army, representing oligarchy, needless to say, the E4s and this entire system that they have, that the Spartan army will come and knock off the Athenian democracy. So the Old Oligarch doesn't like the democracy of Athens. He doesn't like the idea that it's going to go too far and interfere with the privileges of people like him. So that's another important point, right? That if you're an oligarch, you can't really have a loyalty to the nation because the purpose of oligarchy is the perpetuation of oligarchy. And it's very hard to move an oligarchy in any direction because if you convince one or two oligarchs to be in favor of a proposal, all of their enemies within the oligarchy will be against it. And therefore, it's hard to get them moving. And that is one of the reasons that oligarchy generally, it's not dynamic. It tends to be rather static. It just sits there and defends the oligarchical principle against various challenges. So this is all the very interesting political philosophy coming from the ancient world. So again, my watchwords are fear not, do not despair, and my constant refrain, we need political activists, we need people who can educate themselves, learn how to intervene in the historical process, and try to steer it in a better direction. And one of the things that entails is an appreciation for science, technology, industry, and progress. Because what optimism can we have unless there's the hope for progress? Well, there is the hope for progress. Progress is available. It can be done. Here, let's just look at a couple of little things that might push us in this direction. In the presidential election campaign, there was very little talk to do with science, technology, advanced production, advanced industry, things like this. It was somehow just not there, and I hope it will be there. The president-elect has at least mentioned in passing, I guess, that there could be a revival of the U.S. space program, and that could involve a permanent colony on the moon, and I would be very much in favor of that. Obviously, there are questions about whether mass privatization of the existing capabilities. I wouldn't do that. I would use NASA and perhaps supplement it with some of these private companies. Think of the mapping of the human genome, where we had a kind of a race. In the private sector, we had Celera Genomics with Craig Venter, sequencing the genome with the shotgun method. And on the other side, we had Francis Collins at the National Institutes of Health, who were doing their method. And when that converged, that's what got you what you wanted. We're hearing in these days that there is a remarkable decline of Alzheimer's and related kinds of dementia in the statistics showing up now. It's a decline of about 25%. And the scientists don't really know what is causing this decline in Alzheimer and other forms of dementia. But there again, there's got to be a role for the government institutes to provide the backstop, right, the baseline for these things. Because, of course, once you get into the private sector, then there is this temptation to begin transferring resources out of the endeavor and into the pockets of some of the protagonists of the effort. And that was a problem with the genome, too, no doubt about it. But still, maybe some combination can be found. The important thing is to do it. Once you do it, it will take on a life of its own, and perhaps the ownership questions would cancel each other out. It's kind of like the American railroads, right? The important thing was to build them, even though they would go bankrupt, 10, 20 years down the line. That's not the point. The point is to come out of it with a functioning railroad. Anyway, here's what we have. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration and the European Space Agency, so NASA, NASA, and ESA, have been watching these small objects in the area of the Earth's orbit, or that do come in and out of the Earth's orbit. And what they've discovered is that we have an asteroid, a small asteroid, 500 feet across, known as Didymoon, Didymon. And the question now is what to do about that. It is possible that this could, in 2022, I think it is, come and threaten the Earth. Now, this sounds like a movie scenario, but this is definitely real. In other words, the world around us is not this pure vault of the heavens that you know Laplace might have seen, but there's a lot of junk out there. It's not pure; it's chaotic. And the question is this thing going to come close enough so that it might hit Earth? Right now, the calculations are it will be 10 million miles away from Earth, but that's not very far in interplanetary terms. So the idea is to join together the NASA and the ESA, European Space Agency, and the point would be for NASA, well, first for ESA, the ESA would send a number of devices, and this would be done perhaps in 2020, and it would be the ESA part of it would be to land a spacecraft on this Diddy moon. The gravity is very weak, of course, because it's small. The mass is very small, but you could use that to reconnoiter the situation. This is called the AIM device of the European Space Agency. So the AIM spacecraft would release a probe to land on the surface of Diddy Moon, and then they would have two satellites orbiting it. I'll be back in a minute because this is a worthwhile example. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Remember to keep up with everything day by day in these troubled times, and to support the front line of defense of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to organize. It's the American System. So americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Please go there. Please subscribe. This supports my work in one of the most effective ways. So please do it, and make sure that you can, if you can, take the modest alternative of the organizing membership. Right? A little bit more, but it also then leaves us the ability to expand and to carry on some of the interventions that we'll be doing. So what we're talking about here then is the European AIM device, right? So this is the Asteroid Impact Mission of the European Space Agency, ESA. So the Asteroid Impact Mission spacecraft would send a probe to land on the surface of the object and two satellites to orbit it. And then 4 months later, the U.S. device comes into play. This is the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, DART, D-A-R-T. And that will be a kinetic crash. That will be a violent impact of as much mass as the DART can contain. And the idea is that that would then knock this satellite out of its current orbit, it is hoped, and instead of having merely a 10 million mile gap, you'd have something much more. So they've got to also calculate how they hit it, because you don't want to hit it on an orbit closer to the United States. The context for this is also this Chelyabinsk meteor strike, right? Remember in the Russian Ural or Trans-Ural area, 2013, 1,200 people injured. This was about 10 tons and 65 feet across. Now, the one we're talking here with the Diddy Moon is 500 feet across. So, but look at what 65 feet across and 10 tons can do, right? This caused havoc in the area of Chelyabinsk. Nobody was killed, and that is considered to be a tremendous piece of luck, because they certainly might have been. So this takes us into the world of the near-Earth objects, NEOs. NASA has now cataloged 17,000 potentially hazardous NEOs. None is predicted to hit the Earth in the next couple of hundred years, or 100 years, but You don't know that, right? Something can come out of nowhere, right? Some of these things are on orbits that, you can only observe them, like Halley's Comet. You observe them every 80 or 90 years. New near Earth objects are being discovered at the rate of 4 per day, says someone from the European side. So the Diddy moon problem sharpening up for 2022. So I would say that's a good example of what international cooperation looks like, what science looks like, and so forth. And yes, since the president elect says that he wants to, I guess we can say, spend less on global warming research and more on spacecraft and space exploration, I think there's a basis for that here, because one of these near Earth objects can do more than a whole lot of warming. And again, when it comes to warming, the critical part is if warming there is, or even whether it's warming or not. If you find that the ocean is rising at Miami, you've got to create a modern dike and levee system to protect Miami Beach, right? The Louisiana people have taught us this wonderful saying: the answer to inundation is elevation. Not to worry about the belching smokestacks of coal-powered China. There's not going to be a whole lot you can do about that, and that's going to take a very long time, and you're not sure that's really the cause. But what you can do is, where you see a specific problem, you can intervene on that, and you can essentially correct that situation. The alternative here, you want to hear the alternative scenario. You don't like what I'm saying? You want to put more money in global warming? Well, NASA did um, an exercise, right? They did a drill, and they said, what if you find out that a rather large asteroid is on collision course with the Earth and would hit Los Angeles in September 2020? Let me quote here from Sarah Kaplan in the Washington Post of Tuesday, the 22nd, that is yesterday. The finding in that case it was grim. NASA concluded that a 330-foot space rock, smaller again than this one that we're dealing with, smaller than Didymune, this was approaching too quickly to mount a deflection mission. And NASA had to essentially drop out, and the role then went to FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Administration, to figure out how to evacuate millions of people from Southern California. So, which would you like to be able to do? I'd like to have the ability to deflect one of these pieces of space junk from the asteroid belt, presumably, and not undergo a humanitarian catastrophe, right? Because that would be you'd be talking about people's lives. Now then, we want to do our special programming for the Thanksgiving table, okay? And we've been doing this over on the American System, and I'd like to repeat, at least in part, or at least rehash and represent some of the stuff that we found in the course of this past week, so that you're ready by now. Of course, by the time you hear this, it's going to be Saturday, but there are the holidays coming up, right? There's Christmas, there's New Year's, there's all kinds of occasions. And I think, because of the importance of the topic, let's at least summarize what we went into, perhaps in more detail, on the American System, where we have 4 hours a week instead of what amounts to an hour and a half. You got to remember that in economics, you have to have a labor force. Many kinds of Anglo-American economics simply disregard this question: where do people come from, in the sense of where does the population come from, and what is the role of the skill level, the qualifications, the capabilities of your labor force. And the point is, it's not automatic to have a labor force. Look at China. They're going to have severe problems with their labor force because of the absolute folly of looking at some of the kooky American Malthusian anti-growth, zero growth, population bomb people, the kind of people represented by the outgoing science advisor John Holdren in the new executive office building. We haven't heard a lot from him, but he's been doing things, I'm sure. Maybe we'll do a retrospective on Holdren. But you can't you can't have a one child per family policy the way the Chinese have, and then expect to have an orderly labor force. So they've got a big problem. Japan, the oldest workforce in the world, very big problem. In Europe, population growth, of course, is negative, even in countries where you'd expect something else. So that's their big problem. And this is, quite frankly, what Merkel was thinking of when she said, let's let in a few 100,000 refugees, was she's saying, we really have a demographic crisis, right? There are fewer Germans, fewer and fewer, and you've got to do something about that. In Russia, the population has been declining until quite recently, and that has to be turned around. And in the United States is the only one that escapes this. So we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington D.C. So these were some examples of scientific optimism and related issues. Now, we also want to talk about some inspiration, right? Like, what would patriotism look like under these circumstances? Maybe not what you think. I myself have always drawn a great deal of inspiration from Abraham Lincoln. Remember, there's this procedure known as getting right with Lincoln. What you've got to do is to periodically ask yourself if the political line you're following, what you're doing, are those in conformity? Are they coherent with the values and the actions of Lincoln? And that's a good question to ask yourself, every now and then, right? Every couple of months, something like that. Maybe not every day, maybe, but frequently, so that you always keep in mind what values am I actually promoting. We'd be much better off if this were more widespread. So get right with Lincoln, right? Meditate on that. And then there's the issue of other values. And for me, it's clear that the values of Lincoln and of the Union forces in the Civil War, the people who saved the country, who prevented the destruction of this country at the hands of a bunch of irresponsible characters, to put it mildly. So what can we do about that? Well, let's just point out, right? I'm here in the Washington area, so it's easy. We have any number of Civil War monuments, battlefields around here, right? They range all the way from, say, Petersburg, south of Richmond. You can go to Appomattox Courthouse. There are the battlefields of the 7 Days battles. There are the battlefields of the Overland Campaign, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and so forth. There are smaller monuments, right? There's Fort Stevens, north of Washington, where Jubal Early was repulsed in July of 1864 when he wanted to burn the Capitol to get the British and French involved in the war. And then we've got some others, right? The two greatest, I guess, in the East, at least, are Gettysburg on the one hand and Antietam on the other. And I would urge you, when the pressures of your everyday life seem to be unbearable, or when it looks to you like the situation might be, very, very grim, very negative, why not comfort yourself with the example of people who carried on magnificently and carried on to win in conditions which are immeasurably more severe than the ones we know right now, at least so far. And, well, what are you going to do? So let's just suggest a couple of things. The Gettysburg battlefield has always been, in my view, the greatest historical object in the Western Hemisphere because it's got something like 3,000 monuments. It's got a cyclorama. The cyclorama means a cylindrical projection painting of the battle scene as it would have been appearing to somebody standing sort of at the aiming point of Pickett's charge. So you're standing there, Pickett's charge is coming towards you, maybe a little bit to your left, but other parts are coming straight towards you, and you get to see that. So that's the cyclorama. And then you've got all of these monuments, right? Huge monuments. You've got the Pennsylvania Memorial, which is just immense, and so forth, right? You've got all kinds of cannon, Union, Confederate. You've got cannon made in England, the famous Whitworth rifled cannon, breech-loading rifled cannon that were there for the Confederacy. You've got the Peace Light Memorial, dedicated by Franklin D. Roosevelt. This is a good place to go. And this is now a very good time because if you go there in the summer, it's very warm and there are ticks. And if you try to go off the path, you're going to have to deal with these ticks. And this is no fun, right? In the time of not just of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, but of Lyme disease and God knows what. So the colder months now are good. I wouldn't overdo it. I once went there in an ice storm because I had a friend visiting from Germany and we wanted to show this battlefield. Don't go when there's an ice storm. But other than that, or snow, but if you can take the cold a little bit, Gettysburg National Military Park, it's there. And we just had on the 19th, that is to say last Saturday, we had Dedication Day. What is this? Well, remember, the battle occurred on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of July, 1863. That's the battle. And then, of course, on July 4th, the fall of Vicksburg, so a double victory by the Union, this turning point of the war, no doubt about it. And the British and French were dissuaded, and then finally the door was shut on them by the arrival of the Russian fleets in September, October. But the dedication of the National Cemetery is in November. It's November 19th. And this is, of course, the dedication means the Gettysburg Address, right? Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the principal intellectual and political outcome of winning the Civil War, government of the people, by the people, for the people. So they have an anniversary every year. This is the 153rd, this past Saturday. And they have a parade, and they have a very good actor comes and actually he delivers the address, and you have lots and lots of things going on. Go to some of these Civil War sites, reenactor sites and so forth, and you'll see some of the pictures, right? The parade is actually quite elaborate, right? Lots and lots of people come there to take part. So from this, I suggest you can draw a certain amount of inspiration, and you can also put your own predicament into perspective. All right, so that's Gettysburg. Now then, the other issues would be, well, Antietam, right? The worst, the most deadly single day battle of the war, right? Gettysburg is 3 days, so that's the worst battle of the Civil War, over 3 days. But if you ask what's the worst single day, well, that's Antietam. That's 23,000 casualties. Gettysburg is usually up around 52,000, 53,000 over 3 days. But the Antietam battlefield, September 1862, 23,000 candles, or casualties, as we're going to see, 23,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing. So what they do at Antietam is to do an illumination. This is the Antietam National Battlefield Memorial Illumination, held every December in honor of the soldiers, all of them, who fell in the Battle of Antietam or who were wounded or missing. Bloodiest day of the American Civil War. So what they do is they put out 23,000 candles, and the effect is stunning. It is the largest memorial illumination in North America, the largest in North America. And the first edition of this illumination was held in 1988. So it's almost 30 years old. It's a growing tradition. And why not take part? So this occurs on December 3rd, 2016, right? Next week. December 3rd from 6 p.m. to midnight at the Antietam National Battlefield. So you can look on the National Park Service site, many other sites, look up the memorial illumination. I just have one other thing to offer on this in a minute, and then we'll go on to other topics on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we were talking about this splendid event, the Antietam battlefield illumination, and it's coming right up. It's going to be on December 3rd. So, well, the week after next, perhaps, but you get the idea. So, December 3rd, here's the problem with it, if there is one, which is watch out because it entails driving through the National Military Park. And if you come there at 6, there's a huge traffic jam. So if you want to wait until later in the evening, I suspect that might be a slightly better deal. But you want to call up the National Park Service at Antietam, right? National Military Park, and consider going. Right, this would be a kind of an inspiration. Think of what these people went through to preserve the country that we value, that we want to live in. So December 3rd, 2016, 6 p.m. to midnight. So take a look at that and consider it. Right? And if not this year, then next year. I also think this stuff is done by volunteers. I don't see huge foundations getting involved. I don't think that many of the foundations have very much use for this kind of thing. Right? That's just not their shtick. So that means that if you want this stuff to go on, people have to support it. Now, here's a third point. When we talked about Gettysburg, we said there were attractions at Gettysburg, right? One of them is the cyclorama. Thank God you can see that. There's a new visitor center, new in the past, 5 or 6 years. And in that, you can find the painting, right? The cylindrical projection of the battlefield, a dramatic thing. And, geometrically interesting. Done by the French painter Paul Philopotteau, I think, and his crew, his studio, did this. There once were more than one of these, right? There were a couple of versions, and it was a great attraction. We'd travel around, get into a city, be put up in a city, stay there 6 months. Tremendous number of people wanted to see what this was like. Well, now you can see it. Now, the other thing that they did have, which is no longer there, but there's good news coming, is the electric map, right? The Gettysburg electric map was one of the biggest attractions on the battlefield because it's a contour map of the countryside on which you could see the roads, the orchards, the town, all of that was visible. You could make it out. Sitting it used to be displayed in something that looked like a basketball court, and you'd be looking down on it. And the lights would go off, showing you where the various troops were, where they were moving. You'd see them move as the lights shifted. And this was put up in 1963 for the 100th anniversary with an excellent narration from that time, right? Done by, I think, a distinguished actor. I have to check exactly who. So unfortunately, the National Park Service, in their misguided attempt to restore conditions to the pristine pre-battle or battlefield time in July of 1863, they said, we're going to get rid of all of the buildings, right? We're going to remove all the National Park Service buildings on the battlefield. They tore down the old visitor center, with the cyclorama painting. They put as I say, the cyclorama painting was moved to a new and rather nice visitor center. But the electric map they didn't seem to like. So what they did with that was they cut it up. They literally hacked it into pieces. An act of vandalism, I'd say, by the National Park Service. This was under the Bush administration. So go figure. So they did this, and the Secretary of the Interior at that time is responsible. So the question was, would the electric map ever be shown again? It was bought a couple of years ago by a businessman from Hanover, Pennsylvania, who wanted to build up a tourist trade and recognize the importance of Hanover, because Hanover was a cavalry battlefield. In the streets of Hanover, you had a cavalry battle between Jeb Stuart and his Confederates, the famous, infamous, and George Armstrong Custer on the other side with the Union cavalry. So right now, the electric map is in Hanover, Pennsylvania. And this is the point. You can look this up on HHCC, or better yet, Hanover HCC. Okay, HanoverHCC.com. And look up then the Gettysburg electric map. So this has now been restored. It was bought at auction in 2013. As far as I can see, no foundation came forward here. It was a group of community volunteers. They strung 7.5 miles of wire, 632 new lights, again able to tell the story of the most important battle of the American Civil War and one of the decisive battles of the world. You can't overstate the importance of this thing. So it's now, they've set it up interactive, and it's being shown now. It's running as of June of this year. As of early June, this is functioning. So you can see it on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. Additional hours and days during peak season, which I don't think is now, and for special tours and events. So they have several showings, right? There's showings at 9 o'clock in the morning, at 10:30, at 2, at 3:30, 5:30, and so forth. So take a look at this. Here, let me just give you their phone number, because this is a valiant group of people with whom I have no connection whatsoever. I just found this now. And the phone, this is in 22 Carlisle Street, Hanover, Pennsylvania. I think it's the Central Square. And the phone number of the Hanover Heritage and Conference Center, that's the HHCC, 717-739-8364. 717-739-8364. This is a teaching tool of the greatest value, and I have taken distinguished European guests, right, French generals, German generals, all kinds of people like this, and they were extremely impressed by the way this lays out the big picture tactically of the battle. So the Gettysburg battlefield, the electric map, and the Antietam illumination on the 3rd of December. So, welcome back to World Crisis Radio. It's Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. This is our post-Thanksgiving broadcast. We hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving holiday. And now it's the post-Thanksgiving weekend. Get some rest, gather your forces, and prepare for politics, right, which never ends. It just goes on and on. Now, since we are practically here in late November, and we're about 2 weeks away or less from the Pearl Harbor anniversary, maybe we say something about this. Now, I had hoped to offer a book-length study of Pearl Harbor 5 years ago, for the anniversary of 2011, and I was prevented from doing this by the needs of the political moment. And I hope you bear with me. I ask for your indulgence and your patience because I do respond to these events. At least I try to. And you'll remember that that had something to do with the Romney versus Obama campaign and what had to be done with that. So let me repeat, I will have this book. I'm not exactly sure when. Let me put it in perspective for you. You remember the famous Civil War writer, right? The sort of Confederate lost cause sympathetic devotee, Shelby Foote. Well, Shelby Foote was given the assignment to write a history of the Civil War, and he was told to do that within a year, I guess, for the centennial. And I think it took him 20 years to bring that book out. And they bore with him, right? They said, "Okay, fine, we'll wait. It'll be worth waiting for." And he did not have footnotes, right? He's no references in his version. Mine will, I guarantee you, have references, and it'll be worth it. So let me again ask for your kind indulgence, and let me also show you that I'm not standing still on this stuff. I am moving forward, and a couple of new things have come into my purview. So let me share those with you. Now, you will remember that my concept of Pearl Harbor involves, what can we say, incompetence, malfeasance, nonfeasance, or as Lincoln would have put it, pre-concert on about three levels. One level is what went on in Honolulu, right? What went on in the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet and of the U.S. Army in Hawaii. This revolves around Admiral Kimmel of the Navy and General Stark of the Army. Then the second level involved what's going on in Washington, D.C., and here I would point especially to Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who was, in theory, I guess, the second in command of the United States Navy after the actual commander, right, Admiral Stark. And he was, in theory, the head of the War Plans Division of the U.S. Navy, making him second in command. But by force of his personality and by the weakness of the actual commander, it got to the point where Admiral Kelly Turner, was really running the show. He was the dominant personality there. So we have to mention him. But then also in Washington, we have this group at the War Department, which usually gets the least attention of all. And this is a group that has come back into the public eye because of a contingent political event, which compels our attention, which is this question about a registry for Muslim citizens of the United States or of anybody else, right? Any kind of such registry, where the registry can be seen as a step towards the internment of these people whose names then appear on the list, and why that's a bad thing, and who did it. So what we're talking about here is the group around Colonel Henry Stimson. Colonel was how he wanted to be addressed. Colonel Henry Stimson and his two, what can we say, his two helpers, Robert Lovett and John J. McCloy. And I want to remind you at the very beginning that according to the authoritative biographies, Lovett and McCloy were known as the imps of Satan. The imps of Satan. And the reason I bring this up now is that, and we'll go into this more on the American System broadcast. So make sure you go and subscribe. You'll get this entire story. who actually pushed through this idea that Japanese American citizens should be put into concentration camps, internment camps? Well, we have a biography of John J. McCloy, right? He's the notion was, and I think it's accurate, John J. McCloy was the head of the establishment. In other words, from the time that Stimson could no longer do the job, it fell into the hands of McCloy to be the head of the establishment. What does the establishment mean? The establishment doesn't mean the Congress. It means Wall Street. The establishment means Wall Street. So if you're anti-establishment, you got to be anti-Wall Street. And if you're going to be an insider or outsider, this is in relation to Wall Street. If you're a Wall Street investment banker or somebody who speculates with money borrowed from Wall Street, you're an insider. You're not an outsider. The ultimate insiders are the Wall Street insiders because they decide who's going to be a Washington insider, right? They own the Washington insider game. So anyway, McCloy was such a person. He was the head of the establishment. Later, he was replaced by McGeorge Bundy. And after that, one of the problems we've had is that the establishment has been sort of leaderless. There was a weak attempt by David Rockefeller to assert himself as the head of the establishment during the 80s into the 90s, but he didn't succeed because he didn't have the requisite intellectual force or force of will or personality, right? David Rockefeller just couldn't do it. And since then, there has been a bit of a crisis, right? Who's the actual head, spokesperson, chairman of the board, right? That's who McCloy used to be. So let me just quote briefly. Kai Bird, Kaibird, has a biography of McCloy. I think it's called The Chairman of the Board. And he says, quote, more than any individual, McCloy was responsible for the decision to have these internment camps since the president had delegated the matter to him through U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson. And McCloy did this in part because his big moment of glory had been during World War I. He had argued for the internment of German nationals in the United States, and especially after the blowing up of a large ammunition factory in the New York area, the so-called Black Tom explosion. So McCloy said, you see it, those enemy nationals, you're going to have to round them up and put them in camps. So that's what he did. Not Franklin D. Roosevelt, okay? Not Franklin D. Roosevelt. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Okay, welcome back to World Crisis Radio. I think we're in our last segment here in our post-Thanksgiving broadcast. So when you hear this stuff about the Japanese internment camps, do not think Franklin D. Roosevelt. Think the Wall Street lawyer, John J. McCloy, and his partner, Lovett, the two of them known as the Imps of Satan. You'll find this in any number of mainstream biographies. And then they were the proteges of Stimson. And therefore we have to really scratch our heads and wonder, why would Oliver Stone and his sidekick Kutznick, the historian, why would they present Stimson in a good light? This is pointless. Stimson and company are the ones who make possible this internment. And above all, Stimson is the guy who really made the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, right? Because Roosevelt was dead and Truman was out of it. So he didn't know what was going on. So the person who pushed that through was Stimson, who regarded it as his special province. So anyway, the three levels, the Stark and Kimmel level in Hawaii, the immediate tactical commanders. Then we have the Washington bureaucracy, Richmond Kelly Turner. The importance of Richmond Kelly Turner is he's the one who said, don't send additional warnings to Kimmel and Stark, right? We've sent one, we're not going to send more. There were all kinds of people who said, let's send one saying that you're going to be You're going to be attacked like Admiral Togo hit the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. No, said Turner. The question with some of these people is it incompetence or is it something worse? We don't know. So Kelly Turner in Washington, Stimson, Lovett, McClure, all in Washington. And then, of course, Sir Winston Churchill, who had told his dipsomaniac son Randolph, I shall drag the Americans in. Well, he was apparently reading the Japanese five-number code, JN25, and the JN25 was the naval military code. This is where you would find out not what the ambassador was going to say, because you're going to find that out anyway, but where the fleet, the Japanese fleet is going and what it might attack. So I want to point your attention to a very interesting book, Defenseless by John W. Lambert and Norman Polmar. Command Failure at Pearl Harbor. And this is the saga of the Pineapple Air Force. This is the U.S. Army Air Force, Army, the 7th Air Force of World War II, the Pineapples, as they call themselves, and how they tried to have reconnaissance and to defend the islands, but they were not given any backup by Kimmel and Short. Here, let me just point out. Here I have another interesting book on the psychology of military incompetence by Norman F. Dixon. And here, what he writes is that by intelligence reports, by grossly underestimating enemy capabilities, together with an assiduous misinterpretation of the warning signals from Washington, and an amiable dedication to the task of mutual assurance regarding their own invulnerability, Kimmel and his circle of naval and military advisors achieved a state of such supine complacency that they brought upon themselves the worst disaster in American history up to that time. That's The Psychology of Military Incompetence by Norman F. Dixon, British. But here's the problem. If you want to do the defense of the islands, what you've got to do is to set up a system that's going to allow you to do it. And the system which had proven itself in the Battle of Britain, and now we're telling you something good about the British. This was, of course, Chief Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, Dowing. This was the Battle of Britain, right? Never in the course of human events has so much been owed by so many to so few. The very few pilots of the Royal Air Force. How did they do it? They didn't have enough planes and they didn't have enough gas to cruise and keep these patrols up. So what they did was they set up a nerve center. And this was in one building, and they were in touch with the British radar system, the so-called chain home radar system, plus ground observer corps all over the place and other things. All of that information was channeled into the so-called filter room at Bentley Priory, a little bit north of London. And they had a huge table. You've probably seen pictures of this. Look it up. Bentley Priory, Hugh Dowding, the Dowding system. And this was known to have worked. And then you could therefore scramble your planes. You knew exactly where the attacking planes were. You'd get them up in the air. They could then swoop down on the attackers. And the key word here is a filter room. The point was that during the summer of 1941, the U.S. was trying to build, at least there was a kind of an effort to create a version of that. Right? Boston had one, New York had one with a filter room, but Hawaii needed one, obviously, because it was very exposed. And the problem was that Kimmel and Short were incompetent. they didn't know what they were doing, and therefore they did not regard this as an urgent task. Here, the U.S. military's ability, and I'm quoting from Lambert and Polmar's Defenseless, Command Failure at Pearl Harbor. The U.S. military's ability to detect and repel an air attack depended on an improved defense of the island bastion of Oahu. With the advent of search radar, the Westinghouse radars they began getting in the summer of 1941, an aircraft warning service, AWS center, began to take place at Oahu's Fort Shafter. This would be like the British Bentley Priory. It was patterned after the prototype operations centers already built in New York and Boston. None other than Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who had directed the Royal Air Force defenses in the Battle of Britain, inspected these U.S. centers, the New York and Boston ones, and applied his imprimatur. He said, "You got it right." So the Signal Corps, the Air Corps, was supposed to get together and maintain 24/7 a filter room with first with military personnel. They then got, as the British did, women volunteers. So they had 6 radar sets. Westinghouse, they had to fight the National Park Service too. I don't know what's with that. The information center building was an amphitheater. This is the one in Hawaii being built. A huge plotting table in a lower pit depicting Oahu and the surrounding islands. The balcony above contained desks and telephones for officers of Army pursuit planes, in other words, interceptors, Army bombers, Navy shore-based aircraft, Navy carrier-based aircraft, Army anti-aircraft activities, artillery, civil airlines, civil defense, and a controller who would direct fighters once they were airborne. This was the filter center, which received warnings about approaching aircraft from radar units. And once they saw it, they knew where to send the actually, certainly, not super numerous, but rather numerous U.S. interceptors. And the problem was they had all the high ground stuff. So this would be factors in. We'll talk more about that person. So please forbearance and patience. All my friends out there, here, do not despair. We'll see you next week on World Crisis.